Keith Hart conducted research in Ghana in the 1960s as a doctoral student from the University of Cambridge. He focused on street markets in Ghana. He made detailed observations and engaged closely with street vendors, artisans, small-scale entrepreneurs, and casual laborers in Accra. Hart's findings challenged conventional views of employment and development. Accra is a dynamic city with bustling markets. Hart noted that Accra's unregulated markets were essential to the city's economic vitality, although they didn't fit standard categories such as formal employment or unemployment. Many rural migrants skillfully navigated shifting policies and leveraged social networks to thrive under changing market conditions. They often relied on trust, kinship, and reciprocal obligations rather than formal contracts or licenses. These are different operating environments from those in developed contexts. In the developing world, workers frequently abandon formal roles to launch unregistered businesses, seeking autonomy, flexibility, or better incomes. In some cases, informal work can rival or even surpass formal employment in earnings, particularly for specialized entrepreneurs or those who rapidly adapt to market needs. However, many informal workers continue earning less and face fewer protections than those in formal jobs. These findings suggested that unregulated economies required a nuanced understanding. Moreover, they conflicted with the prevailing scholarly consensus of the era. Most early approaches had assumed these informal ventures would disappear once industrial growth produced more formal jobs. Yet, in line with Hart's observations, unregulated markets persisted as a stable, integral part of urban economies in the developing world. Latin America, for example, underwent rapid industrialization from the 1950s to the 80s. Yet these changes didn't eradicate unregulated markets. The formal and informal economies operated alongside each other, often closely connected, or rather intertwined, further blurring the line between formal and informal spheres, and further undermining the notion that industrial growth would automatically absorb all workers into formal, regulated positions. These dynamics are especially visible in the 21 megacities of the developing world, where informality accounts for a large share of non-agricultural employment. Mumbai's Dharavi district, for example, hosts thousands of small enterprises that produce leather goods, textiles, and pottery. Dharavi's population of about 1 million allegedly generates $1 billion in annual economic activity. In Lagos, Nigeria, up to 70% of urban workers participate in informal trade, artisanal manufacturing, motorcycle taxis, or other unregistered ventures. Similar patterns appear in Cairo, Jakarta, Delhi, Manila, and others. Today, we have two main perspectives on informal markets. One is a regulationist perspective, which highlights the unregistered status of small businesses, their reliance on cash transactions, and off-the-books labor. This stance views most unregulated activities as low-wage and inefficient, calling for tighter legal measures to bring them under formal oversight. The other, more accommodationist perspective emphasizes the complexity of these informal spheres rooted in social networks and cultural traditions. Advocates of this view support streamlined paths to formalization and less red tape. Regardless of perspective, a closer look at varied global contexts shows a reality far more nuanced than neat national-level definitions used in developed countries. Many industrialized nations treat informal markets simply as activities outside state oversight, implying marginal or even illegal status. Because most economic life in these nations is tightly regulated, informal work often appears in unregistered workplaces reliant on undocumented labor. Common examples include garment manufacturers in Los Angeles employing undocumented Latin American migrants, or unregistered textile factories in northern Italy employing Chinese workers. In developing regions, however, the informal economy unfolds under very different conditions. Life tends to be more communal and less bureaucratic, at least in some settings. Economic activity often centers on kinship ties, social networks, and mutual obligations instead of formal contracts or government-issued licenses. Regulations and documentation that are standard in industrialized societies can feel excessive or burdensome to many in developing contexts. In the developing world, it's common for individuals to cook food at home and then sell it on their doorstep or at a street corner without much objection. Such small-scale transactions are normal in many places and typically fall outside formal taxation or licensing systems, which focus on larger enterprises. One could argue that the industrialized life is the real anomaly in human history. Industrialized states often consider themselves free and promote their political systems globally. Yet most economic activity in these regions is dominated by large corporations and extensive government oversight. Legal frameworks permeate nearly every aspect of life, and interest groups fiercely policy decisions. Achieving fundamental change in such codified settings can be extremely challenging. The modern nation-state's drive to regulate commerce and document every transaction may thus be the real historical anomaly. In contrast, informality is arguably a long-standing feature of human economies worldwide. Another key factor is that developing nations are products of different historical processes. The vast majority of them operate under the long shadow of colonial histories, so globalization in the 1990s arrived differently in developing contexts, and accordingly triggered different economic shifts and challenges. More recently, digitalization has begun to reshape developing contexts by incorporating gig work and online marketplaces into their economies. Each of these three forces has left a distinct mark, influencing how informal economies evolve and connect to formal economies, as well as to global value chains. India's textile industry illustrates how a developing country can enter and adapt to global value chains while managing local constraints. India has a long history in textile production, but it entered the global ready-made garment market relatively late. Policies like the License Raj and size-based regulations hindered large-scale factories, prompting a proliferation of small and medium-sized enterprises. Clusters later emerged in Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, Tirupur, and Ludhiana, capitalizing on strong local expertise, ample raw materials, and established trade networks. India's export-oriented garment manufacturing grew rapidly after the 1991 economic reforms, which linked the country more deeply with global trade. Unregulated yet adaptable production systems played a key role in bringing Indian textile products to international markets. India still grapples with issues such as inconsistent infrastructure and limited overall standards. These challenges remain part of daily realities in the country. Unregulated markets are far from perfect. There are many long-standing issues, so it's often more practical to seek context-sensitive solutions rather than impose one-size-fits-all policies from a distant international office. Observers on the ground typically understand these daily complexities more intuitively, whereas technocrats in industrialized settings may have a different idea. Yet grasping these varied realities is vital if policies are meant to support rather than weaken the diverse livelihoods in developing megacities and elsewhere.